Let's break down every single player that you could possibly need to add off of the waiver wire moving into week 7 of the 2024 fantasy football season. It's been another week of excitement and disappointment. We've got more injuries. We've got 2 bye weeks this week. You guys are not going to want to skip out on these must-add waiver wire additions for week 7. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 7 pick'ems are already going live, and all of their Monday night football pick'ems are live as well for tonight's game. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a free Josh Allen over half of a total yard pick'em to use towards tonight's action. And don't worry, if you guys watch this video later in the week, you're either going to get a Bo Nix over half of a total yard to use towards Thursday Night Football, or an Aaron Rodgers over half of a total yard to use towards Sunday's action. And on top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. Let's kick the video off with the running back position, and we got a lot of names to go over in today's video. Let's just start first and foremost with Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He was atop of last week's list, and he's still atop of this week's list, but he does sit at 78% rostered, so unlikely that in a lot of your guys' leagues are going to be able to go out and grab Bucky Irving. He's been rostered for majority of the season, but one of my biggest takeaways from this past week overall, in just terms of football, right, is that the Buccaneers are for real. I mean, they barely lost in week 5 to the Falcons, right, and still put out a great showing offensively. And this was a tough matchup against a good Saints defense, and it just did not matter. We saw just about everyone except for an injured Mike Evans have a good or decent fantasy day in this matchup. Now, next week against the Ravens is a little bit of a tough matchup. They have been a good unit against the running back position. And, kind of the elephant in the room is that Rachaad White missed out week 6 due to that foot injury, and Rachaad White might be ready to go week 7. All you Rachaad White haters are celebrating right now because not only did Bucky Irving look really good, and has looked good with the touches he's gotten on the season, but Sean Tucker, who we'll talk about in a couple minutes, also looked fantastic in this week 6 matchup. But if Rachaad White is healthy, I still think he's going to get some volume. I don't think he's going to be completely just exiled from this offense, and he will get some involvement in the passing game. So I do think that will impact Bucky Irving and potentially Sean Tucker as well. So little bit of, some variables here, but at the end of the day, Bucky Irving needs to be rostered in a higher percentage of leagues. 78% is not enough. All right, another running back in a similar position is Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars, sitting at 64% rostered. And I know Tank Bigsby was disappointing, to say the least, in week 6. I mean, this was a player that a lot of people, myself included, felt like was going to be a viable start in week 6 of fantasy football against the Chicago Bears, who have a good secondary but have been pretty poor against the run. And he walked away with just 7 touches for 24 total yards, 3.43 yards per carry, 2.4 fantasy points. But, Travis Etienne got hurt in this game, hamstring injury. Likely that he misses week 7 against the Patriots, but then the interesting thing was we saw some involvement out of Dearness Johnson, of course, after Etienne went down. So 6 touches and 2 targets, 2 receptions for Dearness Johnson. And my guess at this point in the week is that Etienne is going to miss week 7, but we don't know that for sure. If Etienne is out week 7, don't forget, going into week 6, he had a shoulder injury, and now he's got a hamstring injury. And he just hasn't been as efficient, I think, as the Jaguars would like so far on the season. If you started a player on their bye week in week 6, they had more fantasy points than Travis Etienne. He had negative fantasy points, but what can he do? If you started him, it's still a good matchup. He got hurt, but getting back to Tank Bigsby, once again, even though this was a good matchup against the Bears, the game script just completely got rid of the Jaguars running backs because the Jaguars had no choice but to throw the football. Week 7, the Patriots, once again in London, this is a good matchup. The Patriots have been bottom 10 against a run for majority of the season. So I do like Tank Bigsby as a pickup and as a player that we're probably going to be able to view as an RB1, even coming off of a bad week due to the injury to Travis Etienne. All right, that brings us to another kind of lackluster spot running back in week 6, and that is Trey Sermon, who has moved up to 63% rostered. And this was supposed to be the RB1 for the Colts in the absence of Jonathan Taylor. And we'll go ahead, we'll just knock out Tyler Goodson at the same time, who's on the screen at 8% rostered. Probably should have done that for Bucky and Sean Tucker, but I digress. So Tyler Goodson finished with 10.5 fantasy points. Trey Sermon finished with 2.9. Sermon had 18 touches, no targets, no receptions. Goodson had 8 touches on the ground, 5 targets, 4 receptions. So Goodson saw the receiving work. We go back to week 5. Trey Sermon had 6 targets, 6 receptions. Tyler Goodson had 3 targets, 3 receptions. So I'll put it this way. Jonathan Taylor, we know, is out in week 7. This is a great matchup for the Colts running backs here between Sermon and Goodson. The Dolphins have been very poor against the run. I think they're still startable, but you kind of got to look at Trey Sermon. I mean, 1.61 yards per carry. The Colts offensive line has been very good throughout the year. Definitely not ideal, but due to the matchup, Trey Sermon, Tyler Goodson are still going to be considered spot plays as we approach week 7. And that brings us to Alexander Mattison, who I feel like we've talked about in every waiver wire video so far on the year. Sits at 60% rostered. We saw no Zamir White this past week. We saw a little bit of involvement from Amir Abdullah as well as Dylan Labe. And, I mean, hardly any for Dylan Labe. He had 1 touch for 0 total yards. Amir Abdullah, more involvement, 4 touches on the ground, 5 targets, 3 receptions. But this is Madison's backfield, and even when Zamir White is healthy, although he does get touches, this has been Alexander Madison's backfield from a fantasy perspective all season long. He has double digits in every matchup so far this year, except for 2, and in one of those matchups where he did not score double digits, he had at least had a touchdown. So Madison coming off of his best fantasy performance of the year against Pittsburgh. Pretty good run defense with 17.5 fantasy points, and should have had a second touchdown in this game that was called back. It's the Rams here in week 7. It's a great matchup. Madison at 60% rostered. I know it's not an attractive name. I know the ceiling's not super high, but I've been saying it for a few weeks now. He deserves to be rostered in more fantasy leagues. So if he's out there, I do like Madison. Kamani Vidal is next up, sitting at 15% roster. Kind of became a popular name to start stashing in the past week or two since he's come back from IR. And I will say this is J.K. Dobbins' backfield straight up. 25 touches for Dobbins, 96 yards on the ground, 2 targets, 2 receptions, a touchdown, 18.2 fantasy points for Dobbins in week 6. You got a tiny bit of involvement from Hassan Haskins, and we know that Gus Bus has hit the IR. But Kamani Vidal does present some nice upside, and that showed in week 6. Had the receiving touchdown, and I think at the end of the day, we know that this Jim Harbaugh offense wants to run the football and play defense first and foremost. So Vidal, I definitely think in this rookie season could continue to get touches. This has been the thesis on Vidal for a lot of fantasy owners going into the year and the offseason. So he does have some nice receiving upside as well. Vidal sitting at just 15% rostered. If you're struggling at running back, I definitely think should be at least on your bench as we approach week 7. That brings us to another rookie running back. That's Isaac Arando of the 49ers. Now, this is a little bit of an interesting situation because we have Jordan Mason dealing with the AC joint sprain, which could really just be viewed as a pain tolerance type injury. So Jordan Mason could surely play in week 7, He could also not play. He could play but be limited. And Isaac Arando in his limited touches in week 6 looked very good. 10 touches, 99 yards, 9.9 yards per carry, and 9.9 fantasy points. So nothing crazy here, but we know what kind of prospect he was going into the year. Fast guy, great combine, stood out to the Niners. And I do think just the way this 49er system works, we have a lead back here, even if we have a split backfield, those running backs are going to be valuable. Now, we know Christian McCaffrey's return is looming. His practice window has not opened yet. We'll see if it opens later this week, but there are some variables here. But Isaac Arando, definitely worth a stash at this point in time. And Sean Tucker sitting at 0% roster, also worth a stash. Okay, so we talked about Bucky Irvin. We talked about Rachaad White. If Rachaad White returns, what does that mean for Sean Tucker? It's going to be hard to say. Some of you guys are going to think that either way, Sean Tucker could elevate up this depth chart. Some people are going to think, well, Rachaad White's going to play too much of a role in that volume. It's going to be a little bit all over the place. Like we never, from a fantasy perspective, want to look at a backfield with 3 running backs getting touches and, feel like that's a good thing, right? But we have to, look at the stats here. Sean Tucker, 34.2 fantasy points in week 6, 136 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, and a receiving touchdown, and 56 receiving yards. Can't really ignore that, especially up against a good defense like the Saints. Now, it's a tough matchup this week against the Ravens, and then it's a little bit of a tough stretch. Ravens, Falcons, Chiefs, Niners, not fantastic here. So I don't want to go chasing points, but especially if we continue to see any injuries to Rachaad White, Sean Tucker is going to be worth stashing. Once again, he could go into a role that is viable for fantasy, or he could have like 2 points next week. I don't want to go chasing points here, but also very tough to ignore a player that's 0% rostered who is on an offense that looks for real and just scored 34.2 fantasy points. So we'll see what happens. All right, let's move along to the wide receiver position, and we got a lot of players to break down. Let's start with Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts, sitting at 67% rostered. And I do think that Josh Downs should be higher rostered, especially with us knowing that Joe Flacco is going to start for the Colts in week 7 against the Dolphins. So some good matchups coming up here. Dolphins, Texans, Vikings, Bills. We should get good game scripts in theory over the next 4 weeks for the Colts. And I mean, Josh Downs, the first game back against Chicago, a good pass defense, just 5.2 fantasy points, but every other game since his return from injury, 15.9 or more fantasy points, 2 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. With Joe Flacco a quarterback, this offense is going to throw the football first and foremost. Maybe that changes when JT is back, but for now he's not back. There's, no reason to not really be a fan of Josh Downs right now. If he's out there and available, especially if you're hurting at wide receiver, he should be a priority add this week. Okay, let's break down 2 Packers wide receivers. We got Romeo Doubs coming back from that 1-game suspension and whatever he had going on, but I'm glad to see Romeo Doubs out there playing and doing well. 19.9 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns. Now, the volume very low. 4 targets, 3 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. And I mean, this is kind of what we're used to seeing out of Romeo Doubs. For the most part, last year, you break down his stats, low volume. A lot of games are like 2, 3, maybe like 4 or 5 catches, but a touchdown or 2. Jordan Love, historically has had a really good chemistry with Romeo Doubs in the end zone. Jaden Reed got a little bit banged up in this game. Our boy Dontavion Wicks also a little banged up in this game. Maybe that helps the kind of almost mid-season emergence of Doubs and Christian Watson, who just returned from injury himself in this offense. But Jaden Reed's still the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in this offense. But the point being, Doubs sits at 51% rostered. He gets the Texans, the Jaguars, the Lions the next 3 weeks. Should be good game scripts, competitive games. Not the greatest secondaries there, especially the Jaguars. The Lions are playing a little bit better in terms of their secondary. But overall, Doubs is going to have some opportunity over the next couple weeks. I will say, do you want to be careful about chasing points here? There's a little bit of volatility with these Packers wide receivers. I think we've learned that so far on the season, but we have also learned that this offense wants to throw the football with Jordan Love first and foremost. So taking a look at Christian Watson, once again, low volume here, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 1 touchdown, 68 receiving yards, 15.8 fantasy points on the day. So, I think the problem is if you pick up Doubs or Watson, which I do think are good pickups, it's going to be really tough on a week-to-week basis to call, am I actually playing these guys? Who's going to have the best chance to score, especially if Jaden Reed continues to produce in this offense? There's going to be volatility here, but Doubs, Watson, and a pass-first offense deserve to be rostered. All right, let's talk about Quentin Johnston very quickly. Did not have a good week 6 against Denver as expected, even with Pat Surtain suffering a concussion in that matchup. And he did get a little bit banged up, but he was able to return to the game as well. He gets the Cardinals, the Saints, the Browns, and the Titans, Bengals, Ravens the next couple weeks. Not the greatest matchups here. But Quentin Johnston dropped in a lot of leagues because the Chargers had a bye week in week 5, then a bad matchup in theory against the Broncos in week 6. So it's at just 36% rostered. I would still argue that he is the wide receiver 1 on this team. You can definitely argue that Ladd McConkey is, who also got banged up in this game and then returned. And we know at the end of the day that this offense doesn't want to throw the football first. But Quentin Johnston has had some nice outings so far on the season. He looked through the first 4 weeks. He had 2 double-digit performances in weeks 2 and 3, 3 touchdowns in those 2 games. The red zone chemistry with Justin Herbert is there. The upside is a bit limited, but maybe we can spot play Quentin Johnston. Like if you're in a league that you have more bench spots, 5 or 6 bench spots. You have matchups like the Cardinals or the Browns, the Bengals. Like, I do think Quentin Johnston's going to have moments on this season. So, not my favorite, but he got dropped in a lot of leagues. And the fact that he got banged up and had a bad performance against the Broncos might get dropped in even more leagues. So, probably rosterable. We'll leave it at that. All right, Juju Smith-Schuster did not play in Week 6 as the Chiefs are on bye week, sitting at 32% roster. I was actually kind of surprised that his roster percentage is this low because I feel like in every league I'm in, which is a lot of leagues, he got picked up like right away. But if he's still out there and available, 130 receiving yards, 8 targets, 7 receptions in Week 5 against the Saints, 20 total fantasy points, he deserves to be rostered. You know, I think you could argue, I mean, Xavier Worthy is the wide receiver 1 on this team, but they're also going to end up utilizing potentially Juju Smith-Schuster as a wide receiver 1. It's hard to say, right? We don't know what we're going to get out of the Chiefs offense. We don't want to chase points, but Juju looked really good in Week 5. Like, it wasn't just the broken coverage play. Like, Juju was making contesting catches, looked like a part of this offense. And right now, this offense, especially at the wide receiver position, is so thin that I don't think I really need to say anything else. Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid's system. It's the Chiefs. Juju looked good. He's out there. Pick him up. Good matchups over the next couple of weeks. Niners, Raiders, Bucks. All right, that brings us to Michael Wilson, who was a player I talked about going into last week. Is like, this is a guy you can probably pick up and get some points out of. He had 10 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 21 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Not a great matchup this week against the Chargers, but Marvin Harrison Jr. is officially day-to-day now dealing with that concussion he suffered in Week 6, which could lead to more volume for Michael Wilson, of course. Now, I might like Michael Wilson more if Marvin Harrison Jr. is out on the field and the defensive pressure is on MH Jr., but we got to admit, you know, especially if there's garbage time or whatever, Michael Wilson is going to get the volume here. It's not a fantastic matchup, but the Chargers defense also bent a bit against Bo Nix and company towards the end of that game this past week. So I think there's definitely potential for Michael Wilson, but I want to proceed with caution because in this offense for the Cardinals just does not look very good. All right, next up is Gabe Davis, who has a pretty good matchup against the Patriots in Week 7, especially when you bring into consideration that the Patriots defense has to account for Brian Thomas Jr., Christian Kirk, and now Evan Ingram, who returned from injury in big fashion in Week 6. But I also want to say, well, Gabe Davis had 8 targets, which is good, 5 receptions, 45 receiving yards. I think a big part of that was because Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas Jr. were essentially shut down in this game with just 6 receptions between the both of them. So I don't want to go chasing points. He had 21.5 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns in this game. I think this is more of like you got nothing there. Bye weeks, injuries, deeper leagues. You're desperate. You could throw Gabe Davis into your starting lineup. But I'm going to proceed with much caution. I don't know if we're going to see another 2 touchdown game out of Davis on the season. So definitely not my favorite pickup, but he did have 21.5 fantasy points this past week for what it is worth. Now, moving along to Rashad Bateman, who was a player I talked about as a sneaky start going into Week 6. He had 11.1 fantasy points in Week 6, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 71 receiving yards. He now has double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts, 2 touchdowns in 2 of his last 4 starts. So I do like Rashad Bateman. He gets the Bucks this week. This is a defense that is just not good and is allowing really good game scripts. Ravens, Bucks on paper right now looks like a great matchup. I don't trust Rashad Bateman, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of hard to ignore the pattern that we're starting to see emerge here and the fact that this Ravens offense is just so good overall. Even if they're going to run the football first and foremost, this is still a great offense at the end of the day. And right now, there's only so many pass catchers on this team, so Bateman's out there. He's definitely worth a spot play going into Week 7. Next up, we got Demario Douglas sitting at just 14% rostered, and I talked about this going into the week. And my guess was Jalen Polk. I did mention Demario Douglas in the last minute waiver wire video. When I talked about Jalen Polk, I was like, I think it's going to be one of these 2 guys. And it was Demario Douglas who ended up as the beneficiary of Drake May getting the start at quarterback for the Patriots. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and a touchdown. 21.2 fantasy points. Now, similar to Rashad Bateman, Demario Douglas, double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups. But overall, this offense looked much, much better. I know they lost the game. I know that. Their defense did not look good. But the offense looked much better. you'd think what this offense could be if the offensive line didn't completely suck. But on top of that, even though this game is in London, and these London games can get a little tricky, it's a great matchup against the Jaguars, and we just saw the Bears in London stomp the Jaguars. So, I don't know if the Patriots are exactly going to do the same, but they definitely have a shot, and this Jaguars defense is just, they got to be the worst in the league. So, Demario Douglas is out there, definitely worth adding. I like him a lot, one of my favorites on today's list. He did have some other action out of like Kayshon Boutte had a touchdown, 14.9 fantasy points. Jalen Polk, just 4 targets, 1 reception. Kendrick Bourne, just 2 targets, 2 receptions. KJ Osborne, 0 targets. And Tyquan Thornton was out. So really, we're looking at Demario Douglas. I'm going to see if there's any more consistency out of the rest of the bunch here before we get excited on anyone else. Now, Troy Franklin, I just want to briefly mention, he's sitting at just 7% rostered. 11.6 fantasy points in week 6 because he had the touchdown reception, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 31 receiving yards, and the touchdown. He did also in week 5 against the Raiders drop a long touchdown. We're kind of slowly seeing improvement out of rookie quarterback Bo Nix. I mean, there's still plenty of problems here, but Bo Nix, 19 to 33, 216 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, interception, 61 yards on the ground, 21 fantasy points. In week 6 is looking better. You go back to week 5, also not that bad. 19 to 27, 206 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks, and a rushing touchdown, 9 rushing yards. So Troy Franklin, Bo Nix's college teammate, getting a little bit involved here. Should have had a touchdown in week 5 that he dropped. Had the touchdown in week 6. He's just 7% rostered. This is a little bit of a deeper stash. Not my favorite. I will admit it's a bad matchup in week 7. He gets the Panthers, the Ravens. Those are good matchups, and the Chiefs in week 10. So I think Troy Franklin could certainly have moments. This is more of like a deep league, a 16-man league, stuff like that. And there's still plenty of risk involved with Troy Franklin. Next up, we got Sterling Shepard, who I just want to briefly mention because this Buccaneers offense just looks fantastic. They're putting up a lot of points, and this is your wide receiver 3 on this team. He's had 7.4 or more fantasy points in the last 3 weeks with a ceiling of 8.4 points, which is not great. But Mike Evans a little bit banged up in week 6. So that Chris Godwin is still balling out, right? But then you kind of look at the rest of this team. There's just not really anyone at the wide receiver position who's stepping up. We saw some early flashes out of Jalen McMillan, but we haven't seen much of anything since. And they've been dealing with a lot of injuries at the wide receiver position. So you're desperate for points. You're in a bad spot in week 7. The Ravens have been poor against the wide receiver position. Sterling Shepard could at least get you 7 or 8 points, but I'm not going to get too excited yet about Shepard. All right, I'm going to try and run through the quarterbacks quickly here, but the good news is if you need help at quarterback this week, there's a lot of potential waiver wire quarterbacks we can take a look at. Let's start with Justin Fields sitting at 67% rostered. 23.7 fantasy points against the Raiders. Not very good through the air. 14 to 24, 145 passing yards. You'd like to see that start to get going. Pickens didn't look good in this game, or great, I should say. Calvin Austin, there's some missed opportunities there. I guess there are some missed opportunities for Pickens too. But he was, 8 targets, 3 receptions. Austin, 5 targets, 2 receptions. Van Jefferson did nothing in week 6. This team is just missing any help for Fields through the air. The only help they have is Pat Freiermuth, who did have a touchdown that was called back because Fields was across the line of scrimmage. But, it just doesn't matter because Fields ran the ball 11 times for 59 yards and had 2 rushing touchdowns. So he finished with 23.7 fantasy points. And it's not a great matchup in week 7 against the Jets, and against the Giants, also not a great matchup in week 8. But Fields, one of these players that just needs to be rostered because he has that upside from being able to run the football. Moving along, Caleb Williams will have a bye week in week 7, but he sits at 66% rostered. And right out of the bye week, it's a pretty good stretch. Washington, Arizona, New England, Green Bay. There's going to be some opportunities here for Caleb Williams, who has 25 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games. I know it's been the Panthers and the Jaguars, but you got to be impressed. 19 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. He's looking much better through 4 touchdowns. I know, against the Jaguars in week 6, but overall, looks in control of this offense. His offense as a whole starting to click. The run game looks much, much better. Keenan Allen's getting involved. Cole Kmet, 2 touchdowns this past week. I know DJ Moore is a little bit banged up, but he should be okay. Overall, while you can't start him in week 7, certainly a player even in single quarterback leagues at this point, that needs to be rostered. Next up is Kirk Cousins, and I did talk about this throughout the week. I was a little worried about Cousins in week 6. Still a good matchup against the Panthers, but a much better matchup for Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. My worry was just that the Falcons were going to end up running the football a lot. And, Cousins was 19 of 30, 225 passing yards, a touchdown, nothing bad, but certainly not a great fantasy day from having 35.3 fantasy points in week 5 going to 12.5 in week 6. But the Seattle Seahawks are allowing these game scripts that are just high scoring. Look at their last 3 matchups for the Seahawks, the Lions, the Giants, the Niners, all high scoring games. So I do like Cousins still. He sits at 67% rostered. If he's out there, you need to stream a quarterback this week, whatever. I do like Cousins this week. Geno Smith, on the other hand, came back to earth in week 6 against the Niners, just 14.4 fantasy points, but still good through the air. I mean, 30 of 52, a touchdown, did have 2 picks. That hurt his fantasy stat line, but, he still has been pretty solid on the season. And once again, the Falcons, for the most part, didn't quite happen against the Panthers, but we've seen some loose game scripts like that week 5 matchup against the Falcons. So, Geno Smith, Kirk Cousins in the same matchup, if they are out there, I do like both of them as potential starts for you guys this week. Next up is Sam Darnold, who's at 60% roster, but may have gotten dropped in your league. Bad matchup against the Jets in week 5, just 5.2 fantasy points. But he deserves to be rostered. I don't think I need to break this run down too extensively. And it's a nice little run here for the Vikings, Lions, Rams, Colts, Jaguars, Titans, Bears, Cardinals. Sam Darnold's out there. This is a pass-first offense. They've looked great all year. Darnold had the one bad start in week 5 and wasn't great in week 1, but was still good enough. Overall, has been a top 12 fantasy quarterback all season long and should be rostered. All right, last 2 guys. Let's start with Drake May sitting at just 15% roster. Risky pickup going into week 6. If you picked him up in a super flex or double quarterback league, you probably feel pretty good. A good outing for the rookie quarterback, 20 of 33, 243 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 picks. That's expected. 5 rushing attempts for 38 rushing yards, but overall looked in control of the offense. I mean, I know that they were playing from behind and everything, but had some confidence in this game. Got 21.5 fantasy points, okay? I know they're basically throwing around in garbage time, but overall, Drake May looked good enough to be a competent starting fantasy quarterback, unlike Jacoby Brissett. So I'm not going to go crazy here. I don't know if Drake May needs to be picked up and started in single quarterback leagues, but as we talked about earlier, the Patriots face the Jaguars in week 7. So I do think he's startable in week 7. We'll see what things look like after that. And then we got Joe Flacco, who got the start in week 6. And we'll get the start once again in week 7 against Miami. Now, the Dolphins very bad against the run. They've been pretty good for the most part, actually, against the pass. But Flacco, if he's a starter, I don't know how high the ceiling is. Like, he had 26 fantasy points against the Jaguars, 15 against the Steelers, 14.6 this past week against the Titans. But he's certainly worth playing. If you're struggling at quarterback, if you picked him up because he had Anthony Richardson, all that stuff, like, Flacco's fine. I just don't know how high the ceiling is going to be on a consistent basis. But sitting at just 13% rostered, he definitely is an option as we approach the week. Moving on to tight ends, a little bit of a thin list, but Cade Otton's at 42% rostered. Great offense here for the Bucs. They're throwing the football a lot. They're running the football a lot. They're giving up a lot of points. Everything about the Bucs offense is good for fantasy football. He has 7.4 or more fantasy points in his last 4 starts. Only had 2 receptions this past week, but he fortunately scored a touchdown, had 9.5 fantasy points. So good matchup in week 7. The Ravens have been very bad against the tight end position so far on the season. I like Cade Otton a lot going into the week. Speaking about the Ravens being bad against the tight end position, Zach Ertz is my top streaming option at tight end going into week 6. He had 10.8 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 68 receiving yards. He gets another great matchup against the Panthers, who've been very poor against opposing tight ends for the majority of the season. He's a top 20 fantasy tight end. And the Washington Commanders overall have been a great offense that will throw the football, run the football, score points. So I like Zach Ertz a lot. Here again, in week 7, Hunter Henry, beneficiary of Drake May being better than Jacoby Brissett, 13.1 fantasy points, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Now, Hunter Henry is one of these tight ends that worries me. Emerges at times like he did in week 2, then disappears with 5.2 or less fantasy points for the next 3 weeks, then emerges again, but we can't ignore this matchup against the Jaguars in week 7. He sits at just 25% rostered. He's a very strong streaming option as we approach week 7. Finally, we have Grant Calcaterra, who got some action here with the injury to Dallas Goedert, who left that matchup against the Browns early and dealing with a hamstring injury for Goddard, so this will kind of depend on Goddard's health as the week goes on. Not the greatest matchup against the Giants, not the worst, but saw enough involvement in week 6 that I do think that Calcaterra could be a streaming option. It's a little risky at 4 targets, 4 receptions, 67 receiving yards, 10 fantasy points, sits at 0% rostered. Might be better options. It's going to depend on Goddard's health, but he could certainly be a streaming option at tight end as we approach week 7. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single running back, every single wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end that you could possibly need to consider moving into week 7 of the season. As a reminder, I have to record these on Sunday night to get them out in time for you guys. So if there's anything major that happens in Sunday Night Football or Monday Night Football that lead to other waiver wire targets, I will have those in a pinned comment down below. And don't forget, guys, while you're down there in the comment section, I will answer every single comment on today's video. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 7 of the season, drop me a comment and I will get back to every single comment on the video. And don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything that you need here on the channel for week 7 of 2024 fantasy football. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.